In this presentation, we'll talk about the First World War, better known as the Great War, and we'll talk about the conditions that will lead Italy into the fascist dictatorship in 1922. We'll discuss about the first 15 years of the 20th century and how the First World War was actually a war that everybody expected in European countries. We'll also discuss how Italy stays out of the greater European war and rather engages in a private war with Austria as a way to complete its Risorgimento. And we'll also see how in the years after the war, the turmoil provoked by the conflict will lead into the ascent of power of Mussolini, who will take advantage of the situation of disorder. Now, the Great War was actually a long-expected war. So in the years preceding 1914, so the outbreak of war, many events kind of preceded and anticipated a war that was about to come. From the political point of view, so the Spanish-American War with the American conquest of the Caribbean, especially Puerto Rico, but also the Philippines, Guam, Hawaii, and Americans' protectorate over Cuba basically marks the end of the Spanish Empire. So that's kind of like a really radical break for the Spanish country. The Anglo-Boer War, so the war that took place between 1889 and 1902 in South Africa, between the Dutch and the British, is sort of an anticipation of a larger European conflict. And it's actually the first time where the concentration camps happen. So there's the first time in which this is an organization for the encampment of war prisoners. There's another war that kind of attacks the European or shakes the European centrality, which is a war that opposes Japan to Russia in 1904-1905. So Japan wins this war against Russia, undermining Russia's power over the region. Now, you see also that in the Austrian Empire, so Austria and Hungary, there are many divisions that are mounting. The Austrian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, is really a melting pot of languages, regions, and autonomies, if you want. Now, in 1908, Bosnia is annexed to the empire, and the region of Serbia nearby remains in a state of tension against the empire, asserting its independence and autonomy from Vienna. There's another episode that is particularly revealing, kind of a precursor of World War I, with the Italo-Turkish War in Libya. So in 1911, in 1912, Italy is attacking Libya, which was owned by the Ottoman Empire, as a way to grant a solution to the plight of emigration. So instead of sending or leaving immigrants for the Americas or other parts of the world, basically Italy tries to conquer Libya as a way to grant immigrants a status of settlers. So instead of flying away or departing from the nation itself would give them soil where they could settle. The Italo-Turkish War is also the first war where there was the first aerial bombing. So airplanes were first used for the first time. There are also two Balkan wars. So in the area of the Balkans, one is a war where pretty much a league of nations in the Balkans managed to reject the Ottomans from continental Europe. The second war is really a fight of the former allies for dividing the empire spoils. There are also anticipations of the war in philosophical terms. So the most remote anticipation of the war is actually given by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century in his treatise on the perpetual peace. So there was a perception in Europe, in the intellectual circles, that there was supposed to be a process in modernity of creation of the conditions for a perpetual peace. So the war was expected as kind of the ultimate last war which could end all the wars and lead to perpetual peace. Of course, there was like an influence of Nietzsche and his idea of the creative destruction. So the necessity of implosion as a way to create a new modern society, a new modern civilization. And of course, there was in Europe the pervasive influence of Marxism, which we see, for example, in a 1908 essay written by Georges Sorel, based on the argument that violence is necessary for the renewal of society. So it's a very famous essay that's considered like a forerunner or an anticipation of the events that we now read a posteriori. And also there was the influence of the theories of Malthus, demographic theories that were basically predicting a sort of catastrophe in the point where food production would no longer be sufficient to feed a growing human population. So the war was presented as a necessity, or later on the futurists will call it as the hygiene of the war. So the condition in which modernity could reach a balance between its resources and its population. Now, there are also other premonitions of the war, as for example The War in the Air by H.G. Wells, which was really imagining as a fiction a war which could entail aerial bombing. This would happen in the Ito-Turkish War, but also heavily during First World War. Also, the futurists praised the necessity and the idea of war as a metaphor for the intellectual renewal of society, and also as a metaphor for the political renewal of Europe. And in this sense, futurism depicted the war through the idea of a wedge, of a futurism that is penetrating as an avant-garde into the lines of passéism. So war presented as the avant-garde of the future. And the last and most incredible premonition of the war that was about to come is Le Sacre du Printemps, like an orchestra ballet by Stravinsky, so The Rites of Spring, which is presenting sort of a new rite, a new pagan religion is staging in its two parts. First, the adoration of the earth with rituals, processions, and the dance of the earth. And in the second part, sort of a sacrifice of blood, surrounded by a mystical circle of girls, glorifying really a chosen one and predicting through a sacrificial dance sort of the rebirth, the rejuvenation in blood, or the new spring of Western civilization. So this is like an experimental ballet where Stravinsky plays with tonality and dissonance. This is also the staging of a primordial rites engendering a new era for modernity and releasing seething energy, sort of like what some scholars have called like a dance on the volcano. So in 1913, when Stravinsky premieres with The Rites of Spring in Paris, his piece fails completely, is welcomed with boos, and the audience that is in turmoil against the concert and the performance. Now, of course, The Rites of Spring are a classic, but in this context, they are really an anticipation, a year in advance of what would be about to come. So really a dance on the volcano war, an energy that was about to unleash. Now, this is Italy, Europe in 1914, and we have to take into account that the political division of Europe was in two sides. One was related to the Triple Alliance, where Italy, Austria, the Austria-Hungary were allied with Prussia, so the Central Empires, and the Triple Entente, so France, England, and Russia, were in an alliance, a military alliance and political alliance. This until July 29th, 1914, when an event, so the killing of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria in Sarajevo, unleashes a domino effect. So this is the page of Corriere della Sera presenting the event, and this is like the portrayal of the killing of Franz Ferdinand on La Domenica del Corriere. But if we observe like the amount of time, the relatively short amount of time, incredibly short amount of time, where all this domino effect leads Europe into collapse, it's quite extraordinary. So after Austria sends an ultimatum to Serbia for this event, a month after, so on July 29th, Austria actually declares war to Serbia, which is a nation protected by Russia, which had interest in the Balkan area. And there's a perception right away that the European war is about to burst. So the domino of the alliance starts to trickle down the effect, where Germany starts to declare war on Russia, which had declared war on Austria, and then England by its turn declares war to Germany. And on August 15th, so 40 days after the killing of Franz Ferdinand, even Japan would declare war to Germany. And 2 months after, so on August 31st, Germans attack France and arrive at 80 kilometers of distance from the capital city of Paris. Now, the situation in 1914 and 15 is actually quite positive for the Central Empire. So Germany has quite a grasp on European territory. Throughout this time, so from August 1914 to May 1915, Italy actually remains neutral. So Italy is not involved in an war of aggression, finds a clause allowing it to remain neutral, in the sense that this is not a war attacking the national territory. It's not a defense war. So it's a war brought by the Central Empires. Now, during this time, there is a war debate that shakes the country between the neutralists, so basically socialists who remain aligned with the position of the international socialism that saw this war as a capitalistic war and kind of remained aside from it, and also Catholics who didn't want to commit to a war against Austria or in general it's out of a pacifist stand, but in general the war against Austria was perceived as a war against another Catholic nation, so that was the reason to remain neutral. The interventionists were actually anarchists, nationalists, and above all intellectuals. So here is like Carlo Carrà, the futurist painter, portraying like an interventionist rally through the image of like a bomb exploding and a piazza exploding. And this is Boccioni, The Charge of Lancers, imagining a charge of like knights on their horses over the paper clippings of news, contemporary news, breaking through the space. So against once again the idea of the wedging of space in futurism. There were also other intellectuals like Papini, who in Lacerba basically founded a journal that had the activist task to include and involve Italy in a war. And in Lacerba, even futurists publish many articles and many contributions to defend the interventionist positions, like the so-called, by Balla, the so-called praise of the anti-neutral clothing. So even fashion becomes a political statement. Marinetti, of course, was a great promoter of Italy's intervention into war as a way to ransom Italy from its burdensome past and its immobility, perceived immobility. With him, also a young Benito Mussolini becomes an interventionist. Benito Mussolini was the director of a newspaper, L'Avanti, a socialist newspaper, and on the occasion of the war he changes direction and turns into an interventionist, going against the socialist neutralism. And the other intellectual that really draws the attention of the public opinion is Gabriele D'Annunzio, who will deliver on May 5th, 1915, a very famous speech from the shore of Quarto, near Genoa, the same shore where Garibaldi left for his expedition of the Thousand in 1860 during the Second War of Independence, claiming the necessity of Italy to intervene in World War I as a way to complete its Risorgimento. Now, before this speech by D'Annunzio in Quarto, another event must be taken into account. So not only intellectuals push for Italy's intervention and participation into a war that Germany seems to have won. In 1915, the situation was pretty favorable, and Italy could join the war and obtain its advantages. So in addition to the intellectuals that were pushing for this war, there's also another event that came out later, which is a secret pact signed by Italy on April 26, 1915, giving Italy an ultimatum of a month. And the pact is signed in London, and it's signed with England with the promise that Italy will fight a redeeming war only against Austria to complete the Risorgimento, so with the conquest of Trento and Trieste, but also through the pact, Italy will gain the Dalmatia, the coast of the Adriatic coast of the Balkans in the peninsula of Istria and the shore or the coastline of Dalmatia. So Italy enters the war on May 24th, 1915, and Italy's war for the first 2 years is really a trench war fought on the northeastern border with relatively little advancement. Actually, the trench war was mainly on the eastern border along the river Isonzo, which is a river where 11 cruel battles were fought for really limited stripe of land. In this context, on August 9th, 1916, the conquest of the city of Gorizia was seen as a capital gain after a year of really slaughters of Italian soldiers for minimal gains. And another event of this first phase of war was marked by the so-called Strafexpedition, so the punishing expedition of the Austrians to punish Italy for not joining the alliance and actually fighting a war against its previous ally. So Italy entered the war against its previous ally. And the Strafexpedition was a surprise push along the Garda Lake that could potentially lead to Milano itself. That was blocked on the kind of Italian Thermopylis, like on the northern shore of the Garda Lake. Now, the Italian war during the first 2 years was like a war to complete the Risorgimento, sort of to make the statue of Italy complete. So no longer a Nike, like a victory of Samothrace, like in the famous ancient statues, with beheaded, but a complete nation with Trento and Trieste. The war was also an industrial war that was fought in the numbers of production. So the Trench War is a war of production. At the same time, though, this is also presented as a beautiful war, the beautiful war of soldiers fighting on the mountains, and a war that was taking place in very picturesque sites. For example, like the mountains, and it's a very desirable and uncruel war, as it is represented in the medias. Now, the war happens in two areas of mountains, the Alps, that are now really important and popular. So on the one hand, the Karstic Plateau, and on the other, the Dolomites. So sites like the Three Peaks of Lavaredo or the Marmolada, which are now really important tourist sites, where the battlefield, really. So it's a war fought at about 10,000 feet. And also the Karstic Plateau near Trieste was an uncomfortable position, an uncomfortable site for this kind of combat. So this war in high quote, on high peaks, is also called the White War, and despite its being picturesque, was actually quite cruel. Sometimes, as in the case of Monte Pasubio, the enemy was on the peak, and Italian troops were down, like underneath the peak. So basically, sometimes Italian soldiers would dig tunnels under the peaks of the mountains and blow them, as in the case of Monte Pasubio, which saw the defeat of the Austrian army by way of a bomb blowing the head of the mountain. Now, this was also a trench war, a war where Italians from all over the regions got together and started speaking a common language and having a life together. This was sort of a Valley Forge of Italy, where, in Valley Forge, settlers from all the colonies were gathering in encampment outside Philadelphia right after the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. But in Italy, in the same way, peasants and citizens from all over the regions of the unified country, that however spoke different languages, got together and had a shared experience. Now, the singer of this experience of trench is the poet Giuseppe Ungaretti, and really the synthesis of the condition of soldiers in trench, always in between life and death, was summarized in the poem Soldati, Soldiers, in a minimalistic list of 4 brief verses. Si sta come d'autunno sugli alberi le foglie, meaning one stays as in the fall on trees the leaves. So our life as soldiers is as fragile as the leaves on trees during the fall. Now, the event that shakes the Italian war, so this private war with Austria, is the radical breaking of the Italian war front in Caporetto on October 24th, 1917, which will lead to a massive withdrawal, which will bring the Italian army from a line defended for 2 years along the Isonzo to the line established very quickly on another river, the Piave River, 30 kilometers away from the city of Venice. So an incredible loss. Still nowadays, to say Caporetto means in Italian an incredible, unforeseen loss. This loss allows Italians, in a way, to reorganize around the Piave River line and to basically work on their national redemption. So there's a campaign for basically like giving money to the state by a lot of citizens to fund the war of redemption. And this is also the time where the other nations that were allied to Italy, so France and England, and by this time also the United States, which entered the war in 1917, start to send soldiers to help the Italian effort to recover the lost ground. And you might recall that Hemingway was along the Piave River, and his Farewell to Arms is actually based on his story in 1918. Also, another American was sent to Italy, Fiorello LaGuardia, who would later become the mayor of New York City, inflaming Italians to this idea of like a redemptive path to victory in ransom of the shame of Caporetto. Now, in particular, in 1918, there are like new battalions that are formed, the so-called Arditi battalions, so the daring ones that fight and on the Piave River, and they are kind of the Navy SEALs, the special part of the army that plays a big role in Italy's victory in the Piave Battle of June 1918, and also in the advance, in the progress toward recovering the lost territories in the Battle of Vittorio Veneto, so the city that contains not just the name Vittorio of King Victor Emmanuel III, but also recalls the name Vittoria, victory. Italy signs the armistice with Austria, winning the war on November 4th, 1918. November 4th was celebrated as a national feast day until a few years ago. And Italy sees and portrays this war as a redemptive war, so a story of fall and redemption. Now, the real problem starts right after the war, especially after the signing of the Versailles Treaty. So a peace treaty that actually does not assign, as promised in the Secret Pacts of London, Istria and Dalmatia to Italy. And the war poet D'Annunzio, who was like influential in bringing Italy to war, actually occupies the city of Fiume on the Eastern Peninsula, which was assigned by the Versailles Treaty to the new formation called Yugoslavia, and basically occupies the city and proclaims an independent government. So, in violation of the Versailles Treaty, he announces that the treaty is promoting Italy's mutilated victory, so depriving Italy of Eastern Dalmatia, and as a ransom, D'Annunzio forms a new republic there, a new republic which will be seen as an experiment or a forerunner of what fascism will become later. So D'Annunzio was actually a war hero. So at this time, he captured a lot of the national attention, especially of the soldiers. So in Bucari, on the Adriatic shore, in February 1918, he had directed a missile against an Austrian harbor. And in particular, in August 1918, he had flown for the first time over the city of Vienna, so the capital of the enemy, throwing Italian flyers promoting the Italian cause and kind of propaganda flyers threatening the enemy and encouraging the enemy to sign an armistice. So this was seen as a great heroic feat. So the Republic will last only 2 years, so 1919 and 1920, before D'Annunzio was forced to resign and end this experiment. But it's also a moment that gives a sense of the frustration perceived in Italy after the perception of a redemptive war that turned into a mutilated war. And also the frustration brought by the fact that Wilson, who was presented in 1917 and 18 as the promoter of freedom and democracy and the helper of Italy, through the Treaty of Versailles seemed to have betrayed Italy by giving away some of the parts that were promised to it by the secret pacts of London. Now, Italy, during the aftermath of war, is shaken by a new set of challenges. So basically, we were talking about the Arditi battalions, and the futurists who were promoters of Italian intervention into war actually tried to launch a political party looking for the consensus of the Arditi. And this party, however, didn't run much. It didn't have much success. The one who had success with the Arditi was actually Mussolini, who had broken with the Socialist Party before the war on the issue of interventionism, and who looked for support in the futurist Arditi, and founded with them the so-called Fasci Italiani di Combattimento, so the combat fasci, where the idea of fasci was going back to the Roman image of unity, of kind of sticks, fasci. At the same time, with the return of war veterans, there was a situation of big turmoil and strikes, especially in the industry, also determined by the advent in 1917, unexpected advent of the Soviet Revolution, which had led to the fear that something similar could possibly happen in Italy. This was like an interesting case in Marxist theory, because like Marxist philosophy was actually predicting the revolution of the proletariat in situations of high industrialization. So Germany, France, England, not necessarily two agricultural nations like Russia, or in this case, Italy. So there was a period of 2 years, 1919 and 1920, it was like called the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, or the Red Scare, if we want. This also led to a situation of great political instability, with the presentation of several prime ministers or very weak executives. So in 1919, there are like the first elections, and in these elections there are like 2 new formations. One is like the Popular Party, founded by Father Luigi Sturzo, based on Christian values. So it's the first time where Catholics actually not only vote. So in 1913 there was like the first time in which Catholics participated in the new states, but actually organized themselves into a party. And the second formation is related to the socialist presence of L'Ordine Nuovo, like a newspaper, the New Order, founded by the philosopher, then secretary of the Communist Party, Antonio Gramsci, then later confined by fascism. Now, in these elections, the Combat Party by Mussolini obtains only the 4% of votes, and the prime minister that comes out of this confusing election is actually Giolitti. So the prime minister that granted in the early years of the 20th century the possibility for Italian industrial boom. Now, 2 years later, given the political instability, there are new elections. So in 1921, and in these elections, there is a new political formation. So in addition to the Socialist Party, the Communist Party. The party by Mussolini, the fascists, is aligned with a bloc of conservatives and Giolittians, and obtains the 19% of votes. However, of the 105 seats granted by their percentage, only 35 are actually fascists. Now, 1921 is also, however, an interesting year. It's the year in which there is a very important procession from the war zone of the eastern border to Rome, leading like the body of an unknown soldier from the city of Aquileia in the northeast to Rome. The unknown soldier is buried in the altar dedicated, in the monument dedicated to the homeland, in a ceremony that got a lot of citizens involved. So many followed the train along its way to Rome, and this kind of reinforced the sense of frustration of the soldiers who had fought for Italy and who couldn't see the resurgence that was promised. In this context, the Arditi, whose uniform during war was actually a black short, are reconfigured by Mussolini into squadre, so teams, groups of military action in society. So the squadre by Mussolini are with black shirts, like the ones of the Arditi, but they have like a political mission of persuasion through violence in elections. And it is at this time that Mussolini actually founds a party which is called Partito Nazionale Fascista, or PNF, National Fascist Party, after these elections. Now, the elections give rise to a very slim majority and a weak executive by Luigi Facta, which goes into crisis a year after, in October 1922. This is the time of Mussolini's big bet. So within this context, on October 28th, 1922, Mussolini decides that his fascist black shirts, so the squadre, should march from Milano to Rome, threatening a violent seize of power. So Mussolini takes advantage of the situation of instability of the weak executive to walk with his black shirts to Rome and kind of pose a threat to political order. Now, out of fear, King Victor Emmanuel III, who is the son of King Umberto I, killed by anarchists 22 years in advance, so in year 1900. So King Victor Emmanuel III actually confers to Mussolini the authority to form an executive on October 30th. So Mussolini finds himself at the head of a government, not with a party of majority, but with the support of the king. Now, this is the so-called parliamentary phase of fascism until 1925. The parliamentary phase starts right away with the reform of the electoral law and the reform of the school system by the Italian philosopher Giovanni Gentile, who became the Minister of Education. So the reform of the school system was a way to kind of grow fascist consensus over the year, whereas the electoral law could grant a vast majority to the party who had like more seats. The elections take place in 1924, right away, and the PNF actually is very active with its squadre to intimidate the voters, and their violent means grant the party the electoral victory. The problem is that, like, the representative of the Socialist Party, Giacomo Matteotti, at the first session of the parliament, actually decides to denounce the irregular elections, so the irregularity, the climate of violence surrounding the electorate. But after this speech, he is no longer found. He will be found a few months later, at the end of 1924, dead near Rome, and as a protest against the recovery of his dead body, all the other representatives secede on the Aventino Hill. So this is in imitation of an episode of Roman history, ancient Roman history. So they withdraw from the parliament. This could have been like the end of Mussolini's government or experience of government. And this is also the moment where on January 3rd, 1925, Mussolini takes his biggest takes his biggest risk politically. So in a speech in front of the parliament, he basically takes on himself the moral and political responsibility of Matteotti's murder. So Mussolini, with this statement, actually ends a parliamentary phase of violent but still feasible debate and opens up the new phase of the regime and the dictatorship.